David Shapiro here, your personal chief AI officer checking in. So recently I've made a couple videos talking about how artificial intelligence is slowing down. And while I will concede that the deployment of AI is probably accelerating, I've talked about this with the adoption curve, the 7-year adoption cycle. Frontier models are absolutely getting more expensive. A study from Stanford University talks about this, and I'll make sure that the link is in the description. But basically, there's pretty much only one conclusion. If costs are going up exponentially, progress will slow down as people start investing less or as it takes longer to accrue that capital. Now, the next most logical follow-up question, and I've gotten this probably a dozen times in the last couple weeks, is will we still get UBI of some form either before AGI or after AGI? And what I will say is unequivocally, my prediction is that we will almost certainly get some form of UBI long before AGI is implemented. So right now, there are about 20 cities across America that are experimenting with UBI trials. Some of these are publicly funded and some of these are privately funded. But the fact that they are not just all happening, for instance, in California, which is like a socialist bastion or whatever, they're happening all over the country, is a really interesting sign. And what I want to point out is that I've never seen in my lifetime a social experiment of this scale being done repeatedly. And also, it's not just America. Other nations and other states and other nations, or cities and other nations, rather, are also experimenting with UBI. Now, on the same time, there is about, I think there's 4 states that have actively banned UBI, at least publicly funded UBI. There's a few states that have tried and failed, and there's a few other states with legislation in the works to ban UBI. The vast majority of the states that are trying to ban UBI are red states, which shouldn't really surprise anyone. And let me unpack why on both sides. Like, why is UBI being experimented with already, even before AI has had major economic impacts? And why is that some states are banning it almost preemptively? So what we need to talk about is the social contract. So the social contract that America has abided by for about the last century. And of course, it's been refined with neoliberalism. But the social contract is that everyone has a right to exchange their time, their time and energy for money. Basically, everyone has a right to work for wages. And the narrative has been, the quote unquote American dream for, several decades, that if you just work really hard, you will have a rags to riches story. And this, to be fair, has been true for quite a long time in America. You look at the industrial revolutions of the past, the second and third industrial revolution, where, industrialists were born and fortunes were made with building powerhouses and railroads and people basically just finding opportunities everywhere they went. And this persisted in particular into the post-war boom. So the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s is when it really kind of started to taper off, which was basically that there was a target-rich environment where there was far more, the gap between what labor was able to supply and what was actually needed, so unmet labor demand, was very, very high. Now, what we've seen over the last several decades, particularly since the 80s when neoliberalism became the status quo, is that the gap between what was needed and what human labor could provide has narrowed. So this is called economic compaction. And so with economic compaction, it basically means wages aren't as good, wages aren't growing as much, there's not as many opportunities to just go and shoot for the moon. And this is one of the reasons why boomers are so cantankerous and angry, is because they were raised during a peak of American civilization when there was opportunities abounded. And basically, like, I think in equivalent dollars, like working at a grocery store paid like $75,000 today. Like, can you imagine? We'd have more people working at grocery stores. Now, obviously, some of the numbers vary there. But my point is that this economic compaction was an inevitable result of the boom and bust cycle following World War II, with a huge amount of social change and technological change, which both created a lot of economic change. Now, obviously, it's been 80 years since the end of World War II, and that cycle has run out of steam. And so the whole point of this, though, the reason that I'm talking about history here, is because this is why UBI is being trialed right now, is because All of the powers that be, I know that many of you in the audience are super suspicious and skeptical of the government, but there are a few people that think in the government, and there are plenty of people that think in universities. And basically, what they are recognizing is that the jig is almost up. That capitalism, as we understand it today, and neoliberalism, as we understand it today, are running towards their natural conclusion. Meaning that there is an attractor state where you have capital accumulation, more lopsided wages, wealth inequality. And to be fair, this is not the first time that this has happened in the history of humanity. It has happened repeatedly. But Ray Dalio has studied this, and he has said that he's basically studied the last 500 years, but it goes back even further than this. We saw boom and bust cycles going back all the way into the Roman Republic and Roman Empire, around debt cycles, but also just around the accumulation of wealth, where most systems, wealth begets more wealth, power begets more power, and that trend has been very durable, not just in America, but in all nations throughout all of history, until something changes to shake it all up. So UBI is necessary but not sufficient. And what I mean by necessary but not sufficient is it'll help. It's basically like when Rome implemented the grain dole. So again, nothing new. This is a 2,000-year-old idea. So the grain dole in Rome was when they said, okay, the people are not able to own land, or the land that is good is all being consolidated by a few wealthy business owners, and the rest of the land that we can hand out is way far away or it's undesirable. So instead what they did was they basically taxed and spent or redistributed some of the grain and just gave grain away to keep people from rioting. To me, UBI looks a lot like the grain dole. It looks like kind of the bare minimum in order to keep society kind of going at its current status quo. Will it endure forever? Who knows? It really depends on how technology basically makes things cheaper and better for all of us, because, it's like, okay, the grain dole back in Roman times was not going to give you a high quality of life. But with the deflationary pressures of artificial intelligence, what if you could afford a car for $1.50 and a house for $10 in today's money? Like, that's the level of deflation that we're talking about with some goods and services, not all goods and services. And I won't stand by those numbers. That's just a thought experiment. Just imagine that AI and robotics, even before we get to AGI, is so good and creates so much abundance that all the stuff that you need is relatively inexpensive. Then $500 a month doesn't seem like it's that bad. But again, this is all speculation. But my point is that the status quo, the governments, whether it's federal government, state government, or municipal governments, see the writing on the wall. And those that are more forward thinking really do want to avoid riots in the streets and those sorts of things, and they want to find a way to keep the economic engines going. Now, UBI experiments have been broadly successful. They raise employment, they decrease ER visits, they decrease homelessness. There's a whole lot of things that UBI, benefits that UBI provides. It increases graduation rates for high schoolers. All of these are going to be good for cities in the long run, because you'll have less poverty, you'll have more economic opportunity, so on and so forth. So if it's just a way to prime the pump and keep things running, great. Is it going to fundamentally reshift and reshuffle society and solve wealth inequality and income inequality? I doubt it. And as many of you point out in the comments, AI has the possibility of making it infinitely worse, particularly if the billionaire class or the ownership class no longer has need to exchange labor for wages. Meaning, if they don't need to hire us for anything, then money stops flowing up and down across the economic stratum, which could be even worse and allow for even more concentration. But then there's another logical follow-up question, which many of you ask, which is, if nobody can buy anything, how does the economy work? And this is one thing that people are worried about. And when I say people, I mean economists and government officials, because again, these are good questions. Which is one of the reasons why UBI is being trialed, because it's like, okay, the way that I think of it is there's kind of a three-way relationship. There's us, the plebeians, then there's the ownership class, and then there's the government. And this is just one model. And so money ends up accumulating in the ownership class, but there's only one force that's more powerful than that, and that's the government, which can tax them. And so then you just have this little cycle where it goes from us to the billionaire class or the owner class to the government and back to us. And then you can keep the economy churning. And that's at least a very simplified version of the theory. So, in conclusion, I do want to address why is it that red states are banning UBI experiments? This is because there's a few reasons, but by and large, they buy into the neoliberal agenda. They buy into the idea that get the government off, smaller government is better, less government intervention is always better, and they have that as an axiomatic rule that government spending is bad, government spending is always bad, government programs are always bad. If you have that as an axiomatic assumption about the way that the world works and the way that the world ought to work, that explains a lot of the behavior that you see in red states, which is they'll cut off Medicare, seeming to their own detriment. They'll cut off public funding for education, seemingly to their own detriment. This is because they're doubling down on a particular sociopolitical and socioeconomic theory. Their behavior is highly, highly consistent within the container of that theory, despite evidence to the contrary, because it's one way of being, it's one way of living. And I'm not going to get too deep into that because there are merits on both sides of the argument. Red states do have a point that some levels of deregulation and kind of a more laissez-faire or libertarian government do work. Many of them take it too far. Likewise, on the left side, with the more democratic, more socialist, more progressive narratives, there is also such a thing as taking things too far there. You end up with nanny states and surveillance states. And as many people do, the older that I get, the more I'm like, you know what, government, just keep your hands off. Let us figure it out. This is a problem for we the people to figure out on our own without the government holding our hands. So that's my little libertarian side coming out. I'm not a diehard libertarian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm also a progressive. Anyways, you're not here to hear me. You're not here to listen to me ramble about my political orientation. We're here to talk about UBI and AGI. So long story short, my prediction is we will almost certainly get some sort of UBI long before AGI is disrupting the economy and taking jobs. As many of you have pointed out in the comments, even a job disruption event of 10, 15, 20, 30% job loss would be catastrophic for the current economic paradigm, which I think that the people that are making decisions see that and know that and want to head that off at the pass. Will they succeed? I don't know. But these programs are out there. They're being trialed. And of course, we can have much longer debates about how do you fund them? What is the economics of that? How do you do it without increasing taxes or bankrupting the state or whatever, or causing hyperinflation? Those are all very legitimate questions, and I don't have the answers. I've speculated about the answers, but I don't have the answers yet. So I hope this allays some of your fears. Yes, we will probably have UBI or something along those lines long before AGI comes. So this has been a second episode of David Shapiro, your personal chief AI officer. Thanks for watching. Cheers.